The lobby of judgment, the lobby of Grant and Cohen's, was a place designed to make people feel small before they ever reached the interview table. It was not just a lobby, it was a test, one most people did not realize they were taking. The marble floors reflected the light of chandeliers that hung above like frozen waterfalls, each drop of crystal catching and refracting brightness in a way that seemed to announce wealth, order, and a silent demand for perfection. The air smelled faintly of expensive polish, the kind that made you feel your scuffed shoes were a crime against the building itself. Every sound echoed, heels clicking, briefcases snapping shut, the low murmur of receptionists rehearsing efficiency in every syllable. In such a space, anyone who entered was measured, judged, and weighed. Often before they ever opened their mouth into that world walked Autumn Hayes. She carried no briefcase, only a plain manila folder that held her carefully typed resume and a handful of certificates she had earned through online night classes. Her shirt was clean but frayed at the cuffs, her skirt pressed but not new, and her shoes carried the wear of too many long walks between jobs. But Autumn held herself straight, back tall, chin lifted just enough to show that she would not collapse, under the gaze of marble and glass. Beside her was Ellie, her 3-year-old daughter, small hand wrapped tightly in her mother's, her little shoes shining because Autumn had polished them herself with the last cloth in their motel room. The child wore a pale blue dress washed by hand the night before and ironed on the motel desk with a borrowed iron. The hem was worn, the fabric thinned, but it was clean, and Ellie's smile gave it dignity. Her 2 tiny puffs of hair bounced, each time she moved as if her spirit refused to be subdued by the grandeur pressing in around them. The sound of their entrance was not like the sound of other candidates. No quick strides of polished shoes, no confident clearing of throats, no rhythm of authority. Instead, it was the hesitant but steady steps of a woman carrying not just her folder but her child, her dignity, and her hope. That difference was noticed immediately. Behind the reception desk, eyes flicked up. One guard straightened, then pretended to check his monitor. A young woman typing paused only to resume with a sharper tempo. Everyone had been taught the rules of this place, and one of those rules was that personal life stayed outside. You came polished, you came ready, and you certainly did not bring a child. Brenda Cole, the hiring manager, emerged from behind a bye-bye frosted glass door with the precision of a blade leaving its sheath. Her hair was tied high, so tight it looked immovable, her blazer pressed until no wrinkle dared appear, and her shoes struck the floor with the rhythm of someone who believed time itself should obey her. She stopped when she saw Autumn and Ellie, her eyebrows arching not in curiosity but in judgment so sharp it felt like the marble floor might crack beneath it. "You brought a child to an interview," she said, her voice rising slightly, not as a question, but as a verdict. She did not whisper. She spoke just loud enough that everyone in the lobby could hear, ensuring that the moment was public, ensuring that Autumn would feel the weight of all those eyes. Autumn's fingers tightened slightly on her daughter's hand, but her back remained straight. She answered softly but clearly, "I couldn't leave her alone. I arrived on time, and I brought all my documents." She spoke with calm facts, not excuses, because she had learned long ago that pleading gave people permission to dismiss you. Brenda's lips curled into a smile that was not a smile. "We ask for professionalism, not babysitting." Each word struck the marble like the click of a lock sealing shut. She turned slightly, scanning the room to make sure the receptionist, the guard, and anyone else present understood that a line had been crossed. Autumn had been reduced from candidate to cautionary tale in less than a minute. Ellie, too young to understand the words but old enough to feel the cold air of judgment, tucked herself behind her mother's legs. Her wide eyes caught her reflection in the endless glass panels that lined the lobby. She looked at herself, small and unsure, multiplied into infinity, as if the building itself was reminding her how insignificant she was meant to feel. Then her tiny hand, nervous and restless, brushed against a paper cup left on the counter. It toppled, spilling a thin ring of water across the marble floor. The sound was louder than it should have been, the splash magnified by the silence that followed. Autumn immediately dropped to her knees, pulling tissues from her bag. She pressed them against the marble, wiping as if the small puddle was a crime she must erase at any cost. She wiped quickly, desperately, as though she could erase, not just the water but the humiliation pressed onto her by every pair of watching eyes. No one helped. No one spoke. The only sound was the relentless clicking of keyboards, louder now, as if the entire lobby had signed an invisible agreement. We will watch, but we will not intervene. If you had stood there, you would have felt the invisible weight pressing down on Autumn. Not the weight of water, but the crushing weight of judgment. In that moment, her scuffed heels pressed into the marble, leaving a faint scratch, a mark so small it might go unnoticed. Yet it spoke volumes about the cost of simply existing in spaces not designed for her. Then came the sound that changed everything. Ding. The elevator doors slid open. Out stepped Logan Whitmore, the CEO of Grant & Cohen's. 35 years old, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to flow with him rather than restrain him. He moved with the calm confidence of someone who had been watched his entire life. His presence was enough to shift the atmosphere. But today, his gaze faltered not on the polished perfection of the lobby, not on the polished candidates waiting their turn, but on the sight of a mother kneeling on marble, tissues in hand, wiping water while her child clung to her leg. For a moment, Logan did not see a disruption of order. He saw something else, something that demanded a pause. In his career, he had read thousands of resumes, sat through countless interviews, negotiated deals measured in billions. But the real tests of integrity had never come in boardrooms or underprepared speeches. They had always arrived unannounced, disguised as ordinary, even inconvenient moments. And here was one. He approached, his footsteps quiet, but commanding enough to redirect the room's attention. His voice lowered, not to command the crowd, but to address the woman still kneeling. "What brings you here, miss?" Autumn froze for a second, then rose, clutching the damp tissues in one hand, the folder in the other. "Autumn Hayes," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Logan nodded slightly, then gestured toward a chair in the waiting area. "Please have a seat." It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it shifted the entire frame. Autumn was no longer a defendant standing trial before the lobby's unspoken jury. She was once again a candidate being granted the dignity of being heard. Brenda stepped in immediately, her tone sharp. "Mr. Whitmore, this applicant brought a child." Logan's reply was calm, measured. "I see that. I also see that she arrived on time and brought her documents. Let her tell her story." His tone was neither raised nor harsh, but it carried the weight of authority that could not be questioned. The receptionist straightened in her seat, the guard looked back at his screen, and the rhythm of the room changed. Ellie climbed onto her mother's lap, tugging lightly at her dress hem. Autumn placed a steady hand on her daughter's back. No one was rescuing anyone. What was happening was more profound, the restoration of humanity in a space that had stripped it away. "Take your time," Logan said, elbows resting on his knees, leaning forward just slightly. "Start wherever feels right to you." The words sounded procedural, but they were not. They were an invitation, a reminder that she was a person, not a problem. The marble no longer dictated the terms of the room. Compassion did. Autumn drew a breath, and with that breath began not just an interview but the first steps into a story that would redefine professionalism, dignity, and leadership inside those marble walls. The first week, the following Monday, arrived with the kind of tension that only new beginnings carry, the kind that feels both fragile and monumental at once. Autumn Hayes woke before dawn in the small motel room she had been renting by the week. The hum of the old air conditioner filled the silence, and the flickering neon sign outside cast a faint blue glow against the thin curtains. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her lap for a moment before she reached down to touch her daughter's hair. Ellie was curled up under a borrowed blanket, breathing softly, her tiny hand still clutching the corner of the yellow butterfly cup that a kind janitor had given her days earlier. Autumn kissed her forehead gently, then stood to dress, smoothing the wrinkles from the skirt she had pressed again and again. as if ironing could erase every trace of hardship. By 7:30, they were at Grant and Cohen's. The building's glass facade mirrored the rising sun, reflecting the city's rush like a living circuit board. Inside, the rhythm was already set, keyboards clicking, heels striking marble, phones buzzing. But to Autumn, stepping inside with her daughter at her side felt entirely different this time. She was no longer only an outsider knocking on a locked door. She had been invited, given a chance, and though the ground beneath her still felt uncertain, she held her head high. The first stop was daycare, a service the company had on the 15th floor, tucked behind a bright glass wall painted with murals of trees and animals. The director, a woman with kind eyes and the soft voice of someone who had spent years calming. Children knelt to greet Ellie. "We'll take good care of her," she said gently. Ellie clung to her mother's skirt for a moment, uncertain, but Autumn crouched down, kissed her daughter's cheek and whispered, "Mommy will be back at lunch. Be brave." Ellie nodded slowly, her puffs bouncing, then let herself be led into the colorful room. Autumn lingered at the door until she saw her daughter pick up a crayon and sit at a low table. Only then did she turn, exhaling a breath she had been holding for too long. Her new workstation was not glamorous, just a small cubicle by the window with a faded poster of Excel shortcuts taped to the wall. But to Autumn, it felt like possibility itself. She placed her folder on the desk, smoothed her skirt, and began the onboarding modules. Ticket intake procedures, expense approvals, file naming conventions. The language was dense, but she read every line carefully, underlining terms she didn't know, making notes in her small spiral notebook. She treated each instruction like a lifeline because in many ways it was. This job was more than work. It was stability, a chance to build a foundation for her daughter's future. Around 10 o'clock, she met Hector Ruiz. He was in his late 50s, wearing a navy janitorial uniform with a name patch stitched above the pocket. His mustache was peppered with gray, his eyes carrying the weariness of someone who had long ago learned to move quietly through hallways where others barely noticed him. He was rebagging the trash can near her cubicle when she looked up and smiled. "Good morning," she said warmly. He seemed surprised by the acknowledgement, as though people rarely greeted him. He nodded slowly, then pointed at her monitor. "Need an extra screen? Makes it easier on the eyes." "Not yet," Autumn replied. "But I can't figure out how to lower this one." She gestured to the stand. Hector leaned down, pointed to a small latch, and showed her how it worked. "There," he said. "Better. Much better," she said sincerely. "Thank you, sir." He blinked at the word sir, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Most people don't call me that." "Well, most people should," Autumn said with a lightness that made him chuckle softly before moving on. That small exchange lingered, an early seed of friendship rooted in respect. Logan Whitmore, true to his word, stopped by mid-morning. He moved through the rows of cubicles with a presence that was impossible to ignore. He didn't hover or disrupt. He simply passed by, glancing briefly at screens, acknowledging employees with a nod. When he reached Autumn, he slowed. On her monitor was a section on version control for shared drives, the kind of detail many new hires skipped. She had neatly written notes in her notebook, little checkboxes and arrows. Logan leaned slightly, lowering his voice. "That one's a lifesaver in the jungle," he said. Autumn looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes, I thought it was. Important to get right." He nodded once. "Good," he said simply, then moved on, but the approval carried weight. It wasn't praise delivered for show. It was recognition delivered in passing, the kind that mattered more. By lunch, the break room, filled with the smell of reheated meals, Autumn sat at a table with a plastic container of pasta she had cooked in the motel microwave, boiled noodles tossed with a drizzle of oil and a handful of thawed vegetables. Hector entered, carrying a tray with only dry bread and coffee. He sat 2 seats away, the kind of cautious distance of someone used to being invisible. Autumn glanced at her meal, then at his. Without hesitation, she cut her sandwich in half, wrapped one piece in a napkin, and slid it toward him. "I have extra," she said. He hesitated, eyes darting as if expecting judgment. "No need," he murmured. "Eat with me," she insisted, softly. "If I don't talk all day, my throat hurts." She smiled lightly, making it sound like a joke rather than charity. He chuckled, shook his head, but accepted. "Gracias," he said almost under his breath. For the first time in a long while, someone had offered him more than silence. In the afternoon, a ticket from accounting dropped into the queue. Autumn opened it, reread it 3 times, noticed a missing digital signature, and instead of guessing, she sent a polite email with a screenshot of the empty field. 10 minutes later, the reply came with thanks and the corrected document. It was a small thing, but she felt proud. Her first completed task, and done correctly. She logged it carefully, checked the clock, and realized daycare closed in 5 minutes. She packed quickly, rushed down the hall, and when she entered, Ellie barreled into her arms, holding up a picture of a butterfly she had drawn. Autumn kissed her hair, whispering, "It's beautiful." The next day tested her further. Ellie woke with a slight fever, and the daycare called her to sit with her child for a while. Autumn asked her supervisor for 20 minutes, rushed to hold Ellie until the fever eased, then returned to her desk. But when she sat down, Jenna, a woman at the opposite cubicle with perfectly styled hair and a tone sharp enough to cut glass, looked at her with narrowed eyes. "We're not a daycare," Jenna said flatly, glancing at the clock. Autumn's cheeks warmed, but she steadied her voice. "I made up last night's reports." "That's not the point," Jenna snapped, her voice carrying far enough for others to hear. The words landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples of silence spreading outward. At that exact moment, Logan passed by. He had not intended to stop, but the tension in the air caught his attention. His gaze shifted from Jenna to Autumn, then back. His voice was calm, even, but decisive. "Jenna, you can leave early today." Her eyes widened. "But That's clear," he said, cutting off any further argument. Jenna pressed her lips together, gathered her papers, and walked off in silence. Logan turned to Autumn, his tone softening. "You okay?" "Yes," she said quietly. "Take tomorrow off," he told her. "I don't want to cause—" "You didn't cause anything," he said firmly. "You deserve it." Then he walked on, not lingering long enough for gratitude to feel like obligation. That night in his penthouse overlooking the city, Logan opened his leather planner. On Monday's page, crooked in the corner, was the heart-shaped sticker Ellie had given him. He brushed it lightly with his fingertip, and memory pulled him backward. He saw his younger sister Lily at age 7, building a blanket fort in their living room. Dolls lined up in rows. He remembered sneaking out that night at age 12, leaving her alone for just 15 minutes. He remembered the lamp toppling, fabric catching flame, the fire spreading too fast. Neighbors had told him she probably hadn't woken, that she had gone peacefully, but no words could erase the guilt. He had spent years building walls of efficiency, hiding behind schedules and numbers to keep the memory at bay. Yet the sight of Autumn wiping water from marble, holding her daughter's hand, had cracked something open. For the first time in years, he wondered if leadership was less about control and more about compassion. Meanwhile, in the motel room, Autumn sat on the edge of the bed, Ellie asleep beside her. She opened her laptop, continuing the training modules, her notebook filling with underlined words and diagrams. She thought about the way Logan had silenced Jenna, not cruelly, not dramatically, but with clear authority that defended without shaming. She thought about Hector accepting half a sandwich, about the butterfly cup her daughter clutched, about the way kindness, however small, could ripple outward. She whispered to herself, "Don't wait for the world to be kind, make it kind." That phrase stayed with her. She did not know that in another part of the city, Logan was thinking the exact same thing. Shadows of the past, the third week of Autumn's employment arrived like a storm gathering quietly at the edges of the sky. The rhythm of her mornings had begun to stabilize. Wake before dawn in the small motel room, press her skirt and shirt until the iron hissed its protest, wake Ellie with a soft kiss, braid her hair into 2 bouncing puffs, and carry her carefully to the car that she had borrowed from a cousin, a car that coughed every morning as though it resented the idea of waking early. By 8:30 they arrived at the gleaming glass doors of Grant & Cohen's, and for a fleeting moment each day Autumn allowed herself to breathe. Inside that tower, she was no longer just a young widow staying in a cheap motel. She was an administrative support hire, a professional, someone fighting for her daughter's future. But stability is fragile, and in places like Grant & Cohen's, culture was sometimes sharper than marble. By now, whispers had begun to float through the corridors. They were not shouted accusations, just fragments of suspicion passed like secret notes. The CEO keeps walking by her desk. She brought her child to the interview, can you imagine? She got in only because he intervened. The words did not come from one person alone. They were born of a culture that thrived on optics, a culture where perfection was a performance and any deviation from the script was suspect. Autumn heard none of it directly, but she felt it in the way conversations hushed when she entered the break room, in the sideways glances that measured her clothes, her hair, the simple meals she carried in reused containers. She kept her back straight, her notes neat, her work precise. She had no energy for gossip. Her energy was already consumed by the delicate balancing act of being both employee and mother. The balance tilted on a Tuesday when the daycare called just after 10 in the morning. Ellie had developed a fever, nothing severe but high enough to need her mother. Autumn excused herself briefly, rushing down to the 15th floor. She found Ellie curled in a small blanket, cheeks flushed, her tiny fingers clutching the butterfly cup that Hector had given her weeks before. Autumn sat beside her, stroking her hair, whispering softly, "Mommy's here." For 20 minutes she remained, until the fever eased enough that the daycare assured her they would keep her resting. Autumn kissed her forehead and hurried back upstairs, her heart torn between cubicle and child. When she returned, Jenna's voice greeted her, sharp as ever. "We're not a daycare," Jenna muttered, without looking up from her monitor. Autumn's lips pressed together, but she answered calmly, "I made up the reports last night. Everything is up to date." "That's not the point," Jenna snapped. "Professionalism is about consistency. If you can't separate home and work, maybe this isn't the place." The words stung because they echoed the very fear Autumn carried. What if she was not enough for this world? What if every effort still fell short? But before the doubt could root itself, she heard footsteps, calm but decisive. Logan Whitmore had arrived at the row of cubicles, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet authority. He paused, his eyes flicking from Jenna to Autumn, then spoke in a tone that was controlled but final. "Jenna, you can leave early today." Her head snapped up. "But That's clear." He interrupted gently but firmly, not raising, his voice not humiliating her, only closing the conversation with precision. Jenna's mouth pressed into a thin line as she gathered her papers and walked away. The silence that followed was heavy, but Logan did not linger. He looked briefly at Autumn, his eyes softer than his words. "You okay?" "Yes," she said, though the weight in her chest told another story. "Take tomorrow off," he instructed. Her instinct was to protest. "I don't want to cause—" "You didn't cause anything," he cut in, his tone leaving no room for self-blame. "You deserve it." Then he moved on, already turning his attention to the next task, leaving behind a trail of steadiness that somehow lightened the air around her. That night, Autumn sat on the motel bed with her daughter asleep beside her, the smell of bleach faint in the air. She opened her laptop to continue her training modules, her notebook filling with diagrams of workflow and notes on expense approvals. But her mind kept drifting back to the moment when Logan had silenced Jenna. He had not done it with arrogance or cruelty. He had done it with clarity, with authority used not to punish but to protect. It was a kind of leadership she had rarely seen, the kind that didn't humiliate to prove strength but steadied the ground so others could stand. She whispered softly, "If I ever get the chance to help someone else, I'll remember that tone." Across the city, in a penthouse lit by the hum of traffic below, Logan sat at his desk. His planner lay open, and his gaze fell once again on the heart-shaped sticker Ellie had pressed onto its page. He traced it lightly with his finger, and as he did, memory rose unbidden. He was 12 again, standing at the top of a hill under the suburban night sky, arguing with his parents earlier, still replaying in his ears. They had told him to stay home to watch his sister Lily, who was 7. But he had wanted freedom, just 15 minutes with his friend. He had slipped out, promising himself it would be quick. 15 minutes. That was all. When he returned, flames were already tearing through the living room. The lamp had fallen, fabric had caught, the fire had spread too fast. Neighbors gathered, their faces pale, their voices trying to soothe. She probably didn't wake. She went peacefully. But Logan had known the truth. He had known he had left and she had been alone. For years afterward, he had built walls of order, walls of efficiency, walls of ruthless schedules to bury the memory. He measured time with such precision, as though control could erase chaos, as though deadlines could burn away guilt. Yet here, decades later, a child's heart-shaped sticker had reopened what marble and crystal had buried. Logan closed the planner slowly, resting his palm against the leather cover. His chest ached with a truth he rarely allowed himself to face. Compassion had been buried under efficiency, and it was surfacing now in ways he could not ignore. Back at the office, the culture began to shift in subtle ways around Autumn. Some noticed her diligence, the way she standardized folders so that others spent less time searching, the way she corrected small errors without calling attention, the way she shared her lunch without hesitation. Hector, who had grown used to silence, found himself sitting with her more often. She always cut her sandwich in half, offering one piece without drama, her kindness quiet but insistent. Slowly, he began to speak more, to share fragments of his story. A wife gone years ago, children grown and distant, long nights spent cleaning offices where people never learned his name. Autumn listened with genuine interest, and in that listening, Hector rediscovered the dignity of being seen. But not everyone welcomed her presence. Rumors grew louder, fueled by suspicion. Some whispered that Logan was giving her special attention. Others hinted that her position was unearned. They ignored the late nights she spent studying modules, the notes she meticulously kept, the way she carried both the weight of work and motherhood without complaint. For them, professionalism was optics, and optics were brittle. Autumn felt the sting of those whispers, but she refused to bend under them. Each morning she arrived 10 minutes early, reviewing files, correcting errors quietly. Each afternoon she left promptly to collect Ellie. Never late, never careless. She built a rhythm not of perfection, but of persistence. And slowly, though, she did not see it, her presence was altering the rhythm of those around her. The turning point came late one afternoon when the analytics team requested help standardizing documents. Autumn drafted a simple one-page PDF, showing before and after examples of proper naming. It was not her job. It was not in her description. But she saw the chaos of misnamed files, the frustration of wasted minutes, and she chose to help. At first, one employee scoffed in a private message, "This should be IT's job." Autumn replied simply, "If it helps people get lost less, anyone can do it." The message was marked seen but not answered. Yet 3 hours later, the entire team was using her template. The ripple was quiet, but it was real. Logan noticed. He didn't praise it in public, didn't call attention to it. He simply recorded it in his mental ledger of leadership. Small acts that reduced fear, small adjustments, that improved flow. He found himself thinking again of Lily, of how easily the world overlooked the small things until it was too late. He thought of Autumn's resilience, of Ellie's innocent trust, and he wondered if perhaps leadership was less about grand gestures and more about noticing the quiet work no one else saw. One evening, as the week ended, Logan stood by the elevator, his watch reminding him of the dinner waiting with partners across town. But his steps turned instead toward the east corridor, where the daycare emptied into the lobby. He saw Autumn and Ellie walking together, the little girl clutching her butterfly cup, her curls bouncing as she skipped beside her mother. Logan stopped, allowing them to walk ahead, keeping a respectful distance. He did not speak, did not intrude. He simply watched, and for the first time in years he felt a strange warmth in his chest. Not triumph, not efficiency, but something closer to peace. Autumn sensed none of this. To her, each day was still a fragile climb, each paycheck a small victory against the weight of bills, each moment with Ellie a reminder of why she endured. Yet without realizing it, she was teaching the company a lesson it had long forgotten, that professionalism was not about the absence of children or struggles, but about the presence of respect, of resilience, of humanity. And so, as the week closed, the whispers of gossip still floated, the glances still measured, but something else had begun to grow quietly, almost imperceptibly, a shift in the foundation of marble and glass. The quiet revolution, by the time a full month had passed, Autumn's presence in the offices of Grant and Cohen's had stopped being a novelty and started to become something else entirely. To some, she was still a disruption, an inconvenient reminder that life could not always be polished into perfect lines. But to others, she was becoming a quiet anchor, the kind of presence that steadied the air in small, almost invisible ways. She arrived early, left on time, kept her desk neat, her notes meticulous and her words few but purposeful. She never asked for exceptions, she simply met every demand with diligence. And in that diligence, the image of unprofessional slowly began to crack. One morning she noticed the chaos of misfiled digital folders spreading like weeds through the shared drive. She could have ignored it. It wasn't her responsibility. Instead, she spent her lunch break creating a one-page guide, with before and after examples of how to name files properly. She emailed it to the team not with authority, not with pride, but with a simple subject line: "This might make things easier." At first, no one replied. By afternoon, people were using it without comment. By evening, the analytics director sent a quiet note: "Thanks, this helps." It was not public praise, but it was recognition, and that mattered more. Autumn did not know that Logan had seen the ripple from a distance. He noticed the drop in wasted time, the smoother flow of reports. But more than the result, he noticed the way she had done it, not with loud instruction, not with a claim to expertise, but with a small offering of help. He wrote a single note on a yellow sticky and left it on her desk. "Report C17 clear. Nice catch on signature. LW." The handwriting was sharp, compact, slanted slightly right, but one word lingered longer than the rest: nice. For Autumn, that single word was more than feedback. It was proof that she belonged. Meanwhile, Hector grew more comfortable sitting with her in the break room. Each day she split her sandwich, no longer apologizing for the lack of abundance. Extra had become their quiet ritual, a word that felt less like charity and more like community. He responded with small gifts in return: a plastic butterfly cup for Ellie, a packet of herbal tea for Autumn when she coughed, a story from his youth in Mexico when she asked about the songs he hummed. Their friendship was not loud, but it was steady, and in a building where people rushed past one another without eye contact. Their companionship was a small rebellion. But not everyone approved of this shift. Brenda Cole, the hiring manager who had once dismissed Autumn in the lobby, grew increasingly restless. To her, professionalism was a fortress built on optics, neat lines, predictable conduct, the absence of mess. Autumn represented everything she had spent years training people to avoid. The idea that the CEO himself had overridden her judgment still burned. When she heard whispers that Logan often passed by Autumn's desk, her irritation hardened into suspicion. She began dropping comments in meetings. "We need to remember the standards of presentation. We cannot lower the bar for convenience." She never said Autumn's name, but everyone understood the subtext. The tension came to a head during a department briefing 2 weeks later. Logan was present, seated at the head of the polished oak table, flipping through a series of quarterly reports. Brenda presented the hiring statistics, her tone crisp. "We've maintained our standards this quarter," she concluded, "with one exception." She let the words hang, her eyes flicking briefly toward Autumn seated quietly at the far end of the table as a note-taker. Logan's gaze lifted slowly from the report. "Exception?" he asked, his voice even. Brenda straightened. "An applicant brought her child to an interview. As you know, this goes against every principle of professional conduct. Yet she was still hired." Her tone was careful, not openly. Accusatory, but her meaning was clear. The room tensed, eyes darting between the two. Autumn kept her head down, pen steady, though her chest tightened with the weight of exposure. Logan closed the folder gently, his fingers resting on the cover. His reply was measured, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. "Professionalism is not about excluding humanity," he said calmly. "It's about meeting reality with integrity." Ms. Hayes came prepared, on time, with her documents. She has since improved workflows, corrected errors, and contributed beyond her role. That is professionalism. The silence that followed was thick. Brenda's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. The meeting moved on, but the balance had shifted. For the first time, professionalism had been redefined not as optics but as ethics, not as perfection, but as persistence. For Autumn, that moment was a quiet victory. She did not celebrate it, she simply kept working. But she noticed afterward that people's tones softened slightly when they asked her for help, that fewer glances carried disdain, that the whispers faded. She had not argued for her place. She had earned it. Logan, for his part, carried the confrontation with him long after the meeting ended. In the quiet of his office, he opened his planner again, the heart sticker still clinging crookedly to its corner. He pressed it down with his fingertip, remembering his sister Lily, remembering the night when compassion had been absent and consequences permanent. He had built a life on order, but in that order he had forgotten the one thing Lily had embodied: gentleness. He realized then that leadership without compassion was hollow, that efficiency without humanity was brittle. That realization began to shape his next moves. Within a month, Logan introduced a new initiative quietly but firmly, a structured daycare support policy for employees, with flexible hours and emergency care. It was not advertised as charity. It was rolled out as infrastructure, as professionalism redefined. "If we want people's best work," he told the board, "we must acknowledge their real lives." Some resisted, citing costs. Brenda raised concerns about lowering expectations. Logan silenced them with numbers, reduced turnover, improved retention, but also with conviction. "We measure what we value," he said. "If we do not value humanity, our numbers mean nothing." The policy passed. Autumn felt the change. Immediately. When Ellie caught another cold, she did not panic. She signed into the new emergency care room, kissed her daughter's forehead, and returned to her desk, knowing she was not risking her job for being a mother. The relief in her chest was indescribable. It was not pity. It was policy. That distinction mattered. The ripple spread further than anyone expected. Employees who had once hidden their family obligations out of fear began to breathe easier. Fathers, who had never dared to leave early for school plays, started requesting the time without shame. The culture shifted, slowly but unmistakably, from rigid optics to structured compassion. And at the center of it all, without fully realizing it, was Autumn, her presence, her persistence, her quiet example. But every shift comes with resistance. Brenda continued her subtle campaign, speaking in whispers now rather than open meetings. "He's distracted," she told a colleague over coffee. "Personal stories don't belong in policy." The colleague nodded, but the words carried less weight than before. For each whisper there was now a counter-story, an employee who had been able to stay because of daycare, a father who had returned to work after family leave, a team that flowed more smoothly because Autumn had simplified their processes. Stories spoke louder than whispers. Autumn remained unaware of most of this. Her focus was still survival, paying the motel fee each week, stretching groceries, keeping Ellie healthy. But she noticed small changes. Hector smiled more easily now, sometimes humming softly as he cleaned. Colleagues who once ignored her began asking quietly, "How did you fix that file?" Or, "Can I borrow your template?" She never boasted. She simply shared, steady and unassuming. At lunch one Thursday, she carried the butterfly cup down to daycare. Ellie squealed with delight, hugging it to her chest. Logan happened to pass by at that exact moment, a stack of files in his hand. He paused when he saw Ellie's joy, his mouth curving into a smile that was not corporate, not polished, but genuine. Autumn caught his eye, nodded slightly, and for a brief moment they shared a wordless acknowledgement, the kind that needed no explanation. Then they both moved on, back into their separate worlds, yet tethered by something unspoken. That evening, Logan stood in his office long after others had left, the city lights glowing against the glass. He opened his planner, looked at the crooked sticker, and thought of the day in the lobby when everything had shifted. He thought of Lily's fort, of flames that could not be undone, of guilt that had weighed for decades. And he thought of Autumn, not as a charity case, not as an exception, but as a reminder that professionalism was not about perfection. It was about humanity. He whispered softly into the empty office, "Don't wait for the world to be kind. Make it kind." From that moment, Grant & Cohen's was no longer the same company. It did not change overnight, but the foundation had been altered. And though Autumn still walked to her motel room at night, tired and worried, she carried with her the knowledge that she was no longer fighting alone. The transformation, the end, of Autumn's probationary period came on a morning that looked ordinary to everyone else, but felt monumental to her. She rose before dawn in the motel room, smoothing her skirt, braiding Ellie's hair, and whispering to herself the same quiet prayer she had repeated every day since that first interview. Just let me do my best. Let today matter. The city outside was already awake, buses growling, horns blaring, the pulse of thousands of people hurrying toward their own battles. But for Autumn, this day carried a weight unlike the others. Today, the trial ended. Today, she would learn whether she would continue at Grant & Cohen's or whether she would be asked to step aside. She carried that weight with her through the glass doors, her back straight, her folder of notes pressed against her side as though it were armor. Ellie skipped at her hand, her butterfly cup swinging with every bounce. When they reached daycare, Ellie hugged her mother tightly, whispering, "Be brave, Mommy." Autumn kissed her cheek and smiled, though her throat tightened. Out of the mouths of children came the very words she needed most.